The millionaire wanted a child without love, but his virgin best friend's yes destroyed his cold heart. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She stared at her phone for the third time in 5 minutes, knowing she shouldn't care this much about a simple text message. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of Naomi Lewis's cozy one-bedroom apartment, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floors she'd spent months saving to refinish. At 27, she had learned to find beauty in small victories, like the way her spider plant finally sprouted new leaves, or how her neighbor Mrs. Chen always left homemade cookies by her door on Sundays. Naomi sat cross-legged on her sage-green couch, fingers wrapped around her favorite ceramic mug, the one with tiny sunflowers painted along the rim. Her dark brown skin seemed to glow in the soft light, and her natural hair was pulled back into a low bun, a few coils framing her heart-shaped face. She wore an oversized cream sweater that brought out the warmth in her amber eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations without saying a word. Buzz. Her phone vibrated against the coffee table, and her stomach did that familiar flutter it always did when Daniel's name appeared on her screen. Daniel. Coffee later. The usual spot. 3 simple words, but Naomi found herself analyzing every letter. Was his tone different? More distant? She shook her head, frustrated with herself. This was Daniel Bolt, her best friend for the past 4 years, the man who remembered her birthday before she did, who brought her soup when she was sick, who listened to her ramble about books and never once looked bored. But lately, something had shifted. Naomi typed and deleted her response 3 times before settling on, of course, 2 p.m. She set the phone aside and walked to her small kitchen where fresh daisies sat in a mason jar on the windowsill. Everything about her space reflected her personality. Warm, thoughtful, deliberately chosen. The walls were painted a soft buttercream yellow, and vintage romance novels lined the shelves she'd built herself after watching countless YouTube tutorials. As she prepared her morning oatmeal, adding fresh berries and a drizzle of honey, Naomi caught her reflection in the window. She had always been told she was beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty that grew on you. Gentle, authentic. The kind that made people feel safe rather than intimidated. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel. Make it 1:30. I have something important to discuss. Naomi's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Daniel Bolt never said he had something important to discuss. He was direct, confident, the kind of man who said exactly what he meant when he meant it. At 36, he had built an empire from nothing, turning a small tech startup into a multi-million-dollar corporation that now employed over 300 people. She had met him during the most vulnerable period of her life, right after her grandmother's funeral, when she was 23 and felt completely alone in the world. Daniel had been there for a business meeting with her former boss, but when he found her crying in the break room, something in his usually guarded expression had softened. "Bad day?" he had asked, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. "Bad year," she had replied, and somehow that simple exchange had blossomed into an unlikely friendship. Now 4 years later, Naomi couldn't imagine her life without their weekly coffee dates, their long conversations about everything and nothing, the way he made her laugh when she least expected it. But she had also learned to recognize the walls Daniel kept around his heart. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and an athletic build maintained through rigorous morning runs, Daniel commanded attention wherever he went. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his steel blue eyes sharp and calculating, and he wore tailored suits like armor. He was undeniably handsome, the kind of man who could have anyone he wanted, but Naomi had watched him keep everyone at arm's length. She had never asked why. Some secrets, she had learned, were too heavy to carry for someone else. Finishing her breakfast, Naomi moved to her small closet and selected a flowing midi dress in deep forest green, one that complemented her skin tone and made her feel confident without trying too hard. She paired it with simple gold jewelry and her grandmother's vintage watch, touching the worn leather strap for luck. As she applied a light coat of lip gloss, Naomi caught herself wondering if Daniel ever noticed these details about her. Did he see the way she carefully chose colors that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes? Did he notice how she always wore a little extra perfume when they met for coffee? The questions embarrassed her, but they refused to go away. By 1:15, Naomi was walking through downtown Portland, her favorite neighborhood with its mix of historic brownstones and modern cafes. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of rain. She loved this time of year, the way the world seemed to pause and reflect before settling into winter's quiet. Café Lumière sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, its warm brick exterior and large windows making it feel like an extension of someone's living room. Naomi and Daniel had been meeting here for over 2 years, always at the same table by the window, always with the same orders, her vanilla latte with oat milk, his black coffee with 1 sugar. As she approached their table, Naomi's steps slowed. Daniel was already there, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, staring out the window with an expression she had never seen before. There was something different about his posture, tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that made her heart skip. He looked up as she approached, and for just a moment she saw something vulnerable flash across his features before his usual composed mask slipped back into place. "Hey," she said softly, sliding into the chair across from him. "Hey." His voice was lower than usual, rougher around the edges. They sat in silence for a moment, an unusual occurrence for 2 people who typically filled every pause with easy conversation. Naomi studied his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the table, the careful distance in his eyes that she had learned meant he was fighting some internal battle. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "What's going on?" He met her gaze, and in that instant, Naomi felt the ground beneath her shift. Whatever he was about to say would change everything between them. She just didn't know how much. "I need you to have my baby, Naomi, but I need you to understand this isn't about love." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Naomi felt her coffee cup slip slightly in her trembling hands, the warm ceramic suddenly feeling foreign against her palms. Daniel's steel-blue eyes never wavered from hers, but she could see the muscle in his jaw ticking, the only sign that this conversation was as difficult for him as it was shocking for her. "I'm sorry, what?" The words escaped her lips as barely a whisper, her amber eyes wide with disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlacing as he assumed what she recognized as his business posture, controlled, calculated, emotionally distant. It was the same stance he took during board meetings, the same careful composure that had made him millions. "I've been thinking about this for months," Daniel continued, his deep voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "I'm 36, Naomi. I've built everything I wanted professionally, but there's one thing missing, a legacy, an heir." Naomi blinked slowly, trying to process what she was hearing. Around them, the cafe continued its afternoon rhythm, the hiss of the espresso machine, quiet conversations, the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain. But their corner of the world had become eerily silent, as if reality had paused to witness this moment. "Daniel, I don't understand. I don't want marriage," he interrupted, his tone becoming more businesslike with each word. "I don't want the complications that come with romantic entanglements. I've seen what love does to people. It makes them weak, unpredictable, vulnerable. I've worked too hard to build what I have, to risk it all for sentiment." The man sitting across from her was barely recognizable. This wasn't the Daniel who brought her favorite pastries when she was stressed about work. This wasn't the man who had held her hand during her grandmother's funeral or who remembered that she preferred daisies to roses. This was Daniel Bolt, the CEO, the millionaire, the man who saw people as assets and emotions as liabilities. "But a child?" Naomi's voice caught in her throat. "A child is different," Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. "A child is family, blood, something that belongs to me completely, something that can't betray me, or leave me, or use me for personal gain." Each word felt like a small blade cutting through her heart. Naomi had always known Daniel was guarded, but she had never realized the depths of his cynicism, the extent to which he had convinced himself that human connection was transactional. "Why me?" she managed to ask, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. For the first time since he'd started speaking, Daniel's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, but Naomi caught it. She had learned to read his micro-expressions over the years, to find the man beneath the armor. "Because I trust you," he said simply. "You're the only person in my life who has never wanted anything from me. You've never asked for money, connections, favors. You're pure, in a way that's rare in my world." The word pure made her stomach clench. If only he knew how impure her thoughts had been lately, how many nights she had fallen asleep thinking about what it would feel like to be more than just his friend. "I would provide for everything, of course," Daniel continued, slipping back into business mode. "The best healthcare, a beautiful nursery, college funds, trust funds. You would never want for anything, and neither would our child. I would be a good father, Naomi. Present, involved, committed to giving them every advantage. Our child, she repeated softly, the phrase sounding foreign on her tongue. I know it's unconventional, but think about it practically. We already have a solid foundation of friendship and trust. We enjoy each other's company. We share similar values about family and integrity. Most marriages have less going for them than we do. Naomi felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry. Not here, not now, not when Daniel was watching her with those calculating eyes. Waiting for her response like this was just another business proposal. But it wasn't just another business proposal, was it? This was her heart he was negotiating with, her body he was discussing like a commodity, her future he was trying to purchase with his careful words and logical arguments. I need time to think, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the afternoon noise of the cafe. Daniel nodded as if he had expected this response. Of course, it's a big decision, I understand that. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, a gesture that would have sent electricity through her system just an hour ago, but now felt strangely hollow. Take all the time you need, Naomi, but know that I wouldn't have asked if I didn't believe you were the perfect person for this. The perfect person. Not the woman he loved, not someone he couldn't live without. The perfect candidate for a position he needed to fill. Naomi pulled her hand away gently and stood up, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. I should go. Naomi, I need to process this, Daniel. I just need time. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the door, feeling his eyes on her back with every step. Outside, the autumn air hit her face like a slap, sharp and clarifying. She walked quickly away from the cafe, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. By the time she reached her apartment building, tears were streaming down her cheeks. She fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock her door and collapse onto her couch. The same couch where she had sat that morning, analyzing his text message like a lovesick teenager. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her phone buzzed with a new message. Daniel, I know this is overwhelming, but I meant what I said. I trust you more than anyone else in my life. That has to count for something. Naomi stared at the message, her heart breaking and healing and breaking again with each word. He trusted her. He wanted her to have his child, but he didn't love her. And somehow, that made the decision both impossible and inevitable. As the sun set outside her window, painting her apartment in shades of gold and amber, Naomi realized that everything between them had changed in the span of a single conversation. There was no going back to their comfortable friendship, no pretending this conversation hadn't happened. She was going to have to choose, walk away from the man who had become her closest friend, or step into something that might destroy her heart completely. But as she sat there in the growing darkness, one truth crystallized in her mind with painful clarity. She was already in love with Daniel Bolt. She had been for years, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly why she was going to say yes. 3 days of silence stretched between them like an ocean, until her phone rang at 11:47 p.m. with the call that would change everything. Naomi had been staring at the ceiling of her bedroom for what felt like hours, watching shadows from passing cars dance across the textured surface. Sleep had become elusive since her conversation with Daniel, replaced by an endless loop of questions that seemed to have no right answers. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed an accusatory 11:47 p.m. when her phone began buzzing against the wooden surface. Daniel's name lit up the screen, and her heart immediately began racing. She had been avoiding his calls for 3 days. Hello? Her voice came out rougher than intended, thick with exhaustion and unshed tears. Naomi. Just her name, spoken in that deep voice she knew so well, but there was something different about it now, something vulnerable that made her sit up in bed. Daniel, it's nearly midnight. I can't sleep, he interrupted, and she could hear movement in the background like he was pacing. I haven't slept properly since our conversation. I keep thinking about what I said, how I said it. Naomi pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her free arm around her legs. She was wearing an old cotton nightgown in soft lavender, and her natural hair was loose around her shoulders, the most unguarded version of herself. I've been thinking too, she admitted quietly. There was a pause, and she could picture him in his penthouse apartment, probably standing by those floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, still wearing his work clothes because he'd forgotten to change, his dark hair disheveled from running his hands through it. I handled that terribly, Daniel said finally. I approached it like a business deal, and that wasn't fair to you. You deserve better than that. Do I? The question slipped out before she could stop it, carrying more pain than she'd intended to reveal. "Naomi?" His voice softened in a way that made her chest ache. "You deserve everything good in this world. You deserve a man who loves you completely, who sees you as the extraordinary woman you are, who would move mountains just to see you smile." Tears began sliding down her cheeks silently. "But that man isn't you." The silence that followed was deafening. "I don't know how to be that man," Daniel whispered, and she could hear the rawness in his confession. "I don't know how to open myself up to that kind of vulnerability. Every time I've tried, it's ended in betrayal or manipulation or disappointment." Naomi closed her eyes, remembering fragments of stories he'd shared over the years. His ex-fiancée who had cheated with his business partner, his mother who had used his father's love as a weapon, the string of relationships that had been built on his wealth rather than who he was beneath it all. "So you decided it was safer to just not try?" she asked gently. "I decided it was smarter to focus on what I could control," he replied. "Business, success, financial security. Things that have concrete rules and predictable outcomes. Children aren't predictable, Daniel." A soft laugh escaped him, the first genuine sound of humor she'd heard from him in days. "No, they're not. But they're also innocent. A child would love me for who I am, not what I can provide. At least, at first." The resignation in his voice broke her heart a little more. "What happened to you?" Naomi asked softly. "What made you so afraid of being loved?" Another long pause, and she thought he might hang up. But then his voice came through the phone, quiet and careful. "When I was 12, my parents got divorced. Messy, ugly, dragged on for 2 years. My mother used me as leverage, told me my father didn't really want me around, that he was only fighting for custody to hurt her. My father did the same thing in reverse. By the time it was over, I realized that love could be weaponized, that the people who claim to love you the most can also hurt you the deepest." Naomi felt her heart crack open for the little boy he'd been, caught between two adults who had forgotten that love was supposed to protect, not destroy. "I'm not your parents, Daniel," she said quietly. "I know." His response was immediate, certain. "That's why I asked you. Because I'm safe. Because you're genuine. Because in 4 years, you've never asked me for anything except friendship. Because you laugh at my terrible jokes and remember that I don't like onions in my sandwiches, and you've never once looked at me like I was a bank account with legs." Despite everything, Naomi felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Your jokes aren't that terrible. They're pretty terrible," Daniel said, and she could hear the smile in his voice too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of easy quiet that had always existed between them before everything became complicated. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Naomi said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She heard his sharp intake of breath. "And I need to ask you something first, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay. If I said yes, if I agreed to this arrangement, would there be any room for something more to develop between us? Or are you completely closed off to that possibility?" The pause that followed seemed to stretch on forever. "Naomi," Daniel's voice was strained, like he was fighting some internal battle. "I don't want to give you false hope. I don't want you to agree to this thinking that I might change, that I might suddenly become the man you deserve. That's not what I asked," she pressed gently. "I asked if you were completely closed off to the possibility." Another pause, shorter this time. "No," he admitted quietly, "I'm not completely closed off to it, but I'm terrified of it. I'm terrified of hurting you, of disappointing you, of proving that I'm exactly as broken as I think I am." Naomi felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but not despair either. Something like possibility. "What if," she said slowly, carefully, "what if we approach this differently?" "How do you mean?" "What if instead of this being a business arrangement, we called it what it actually is? Two friends who care about each other, taking a leap of faith together." "Naomi, I'm not asking you to love me, Daniel. I'm not asking you to promise me forever. I'm just asking you to be open to whatever this becomes." The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and fear in equal measure. "You would do that?" Daniel asked finally, his voice thick with emotion she'd rarely heard from him. "You would take that risk?" Naomi took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall. "Yes," she whispered, "I would take that risk." And as the word left her lips, she realized that her heart had made the decision days ago. Everything else had just been her mind catching up. The pregnancy test sat on her bathroom counter like a tiny oracle, holding secrets that could rewrite both their futures in pink lines or blank spaces. 6 weeks had passed since that midnight phone call, and Naomi's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. What had started as Daniel's clinical proposal had evolved into something that felt surprisingly natural. They had spent countless hours together, talking about everything from childhood memories to their hopes for the future. Daniel had insisted on taking her to the best fertility specialist in Portland, Dr. Winters, a kind woman with silver hair and gentle hands who had made the entire process feel less intimidating. But it wasn't the medical appointments that had surprised Naomi. It was the small moments in between, like how Daniel had started bringing her herbal tea instead of coffee, claiming he'd read somewhere that it was better for preparing the body, or how he'd begun showing up at her apartment with grocery bags full of organic vegetables, insisting that proper nutrition was essential, or how he'd installed a new air purifier in her bedroom because he'd become obsessed with creating the perfect environment. "You know I'm not actually pregnant yet, right?" Naomi had teased him just the week before, watching him arrange prenatal vitamins on her kitchen counter like he was conducting a symphony. Daniel had paused, his hands stilling on the bottles, and for a moment she'd seen something vulnerable flash across his face. "I know, I want everything to be perfect. When it happens, I want to know we did everything right." The care in his voice, the gentle way he'd started touching her, a hand on her lower back, fingers brushing hers when he passed her something. It was all so different from the cold businessman who had made that initial proposal. Now, standing in her small bathroom at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, Naomi felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been feeling different for the past week, tired, slightly nauseous, unusually emotional. This morning, she'd woken up with a strange certainty that everything was about to change. The test instructions were simple enough, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely read them. She followed the steps mechanically, then set the small plastic device on the counter and sat down on the closed toilet seat to wait. 3 minutes. That's all it would take to know if their careful planning had worked, if their leap of faith had resulted in the tiny miracle they'd been hoping for. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Daniel, good morning, how are you feeling today?" He had been asking her that question every morning for weeks, his concern growing more evident each day. At first, she'd thought it was just him being thorough, but lately she'd begun to recognize it for what it really was, genuine care masked as practicality. She started to type a response, then stopped. How could she tell him she was currently waiting to find out if she was carrying his child? How could she put that kind of hope and fear into words? Instead, she typed, "I'm okay. Are you still coming over for dinner tonight?" Another new development, Daniel had started joining her for meals several times a week. He claimed it was to ensure she was eating properly, but Naomi had noticed how he lingered afterward, helping with dishes, asking about her day, seeming reluctant to leave the warm comfort of her small apartment. "Daniel, wouldn't miss it. I'm bringing ingredients for that pasta dish you mentioned liking." Despite her nervousness, Naomi smiled. A month ago, Daniel Bolt probably couldn't have told you where his own kitchen was, let alone what ingredients went into homemade pasta sauce. Now he was researching recipes and shopping for groceries like a devoted husband. Husband. The word sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. They hadn't talked about what would happen if she got pregnant, the practical details of how they would navigate parenthood together. Daniel had been so focused on the getting pregnant part that they'd barely discussed the being pregnant part, let alone the raising a child together part. Her phone timer chimed, making her jump. 3 minutes were up. Naomi stood on unsteady legs and approached the counter. The test sat there innocuously, looking like nothing more than a piece of plastic that cost $12 at the pharmacy. But she knew that what it revealed would change everything. She picked it up with trembling fingers. 2 pink lines, clear, unmistakable, life-changing pink lines. Naomi sank down onto the bathroom floor, the test still clutched in her hands as the reality washed over her in waves. She was pregnant, with Daniel's baby. The arrangement they had made was no longer theoretical. It was growing inside her at this very moment. Tears began streaming down her face, but she couldn't tell if they were from joy or terror or some complex mixture of both. She was going to be a mother. Daniel was going to be a father. They were going to have a baby together. Her phone rang, startling her out of her daze. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a wild moment she considered not answering. How could she have a normal conversation with him when she was sitting on her bathroom floor, holding proof that their lives were about to become permanently intertwined? But this was Daniel, her friend, her partner in this impossible situation. He deserved to know. "Hello?" Her voice came out shaky and strange. "Naomi? Are you all right? You sound—" "Daniel." She cut him off, unable to find a gentle way to ease into this moment. "I'm pregnant." Silence. Complete, absolute silence on the other end of the line. "Daniel? Are you there?" His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Are you sure?" Naomi looked down at the test in her hands, at those two definitive pink lines that had just rewritten both their futures. "I'm sure." Another pause, and then she heard something that made her heart skip, a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been a sob, or might have been both. "We did it," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Naomi, we actually did it." "Yeah," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "We did. I'm coming over," he said suddenly, his voice becoming stronger, more decisive. "Right now, I'm coming over." "Daniel, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." His tone was firm, almost fierce. "You're carrying my child, Naomi, our child. I'm not going to be anywhere else right now." The line went dead, and Naomi found herself staring at her phone, still sitting on her bathroom floor in her pajamas, holding a pregnancy test and trying to process the fact that Daniel Bolt, the man who claimed he didn't know how to love, had just sounded more emotional than she'd ever heard him. 20 minutes later, she heard his key in her front door. She had given it to him weeks ago, ostensibly so he could let himself in when he brought groceries, but now, as she heard his footsteps moving quickly through her apartment, she realized it meant something else entirely. It meant he was already thinking of her place as home. "Naomi," his voice carried down the hallway. "In here," she called softly from where she now sat on her couch, having finally managed to pull herself together enough to leave the bathroom. Daniel appeared in her living room doorway, still wearing his expensive suit, but with his hair disheveled and his tie slightly askew, like he'd rushed out of a meeting. His steel blue eyes were bright, with an emotion she'd never seen before, something raw and wonderful and terrifying all at once. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and dropped to his knees in front of her, his large hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that took her breath away. "Show me," he whispered. Naomi held up the pregnancy test, watching as Daniel's eyes fixed on those 2 pink lines. His expression transformed completely, the careful mask he always wore cracking open to reveal something so vulnerable and hopeful that it made her chest ache. "My God," he breathed, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her against his chest so tightly she could feel his heart racing. "Naomi, my God." And in that moment, pressed against Daniel's chest while he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, Naomi realized that whatever happened next, whatever this arrangement became, she had never felt more cherished in her entire life. "Move in with me," Daniel said over breakfast, as casually as if he were asking her to pass the salt, but his hands were trembling around his coffee cup. 3 weeks had passed since that life-changing morning, and Naomi was beginning to understand that pregnancy came with its own unique form of emotional whiplash. One moment she'd be crying over a commercial about puppies, the next she'd be irrationally angry at Daniel for breathing too loudly. This morning was different, though. This morning she felt oddly serene as she sat across from him at her small dining table, watching him attempt to make pancakes from scratch. His usually perfect hair was mussed, his expensive dress shirt was dusted with flour, and he had a look of intense concentration that she might have found amusing if it weren't so endearing. "You know there's a perfectly good box mix in the pantry," Naomi said, taking a sip of her ginger tea, another one of Daniel's research-backed suggestions for morning sickness. "Box mix has preservatives," he replied, without looking up from the bowl where he was whisking with the determination of a man trying to solve world hunger. Dr. Kimberly said fresh, whole ingredients are better for early pregnancy development. Dr. Kimberly Winters had become something of a saint in Daniel's eyes over the past few weeks. Every recommendation, every offhand comment, every piece of advice was treated like gospel. Naomi had watched this incredibly successful, confident man transform into someone who took notes during medical appointments and asked follow-up questions about calcium absorption rates. "Daniel," she said gently, "they're just pancakes." He looked up at her then, and she saw something flicker across his features, a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. "Nothing is just anything anymore, Naomi. Not when it comes to you and the baby. The baby." He had started saying it like that, with a reverence that made her believe he was already half in love with the tiny collection of cells growing inside her. Sometimes she caught him staring at her stomach with an expression of such wonder that it took her breath away. "Move in with me," he said suddenly, setting down the whisk. Naomi blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Daniel sat down across from her, his steel blue eyes serious and focused. "Move in with me. To the penthouse. You shouldn't be living alone right now, not when you're carrying—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Not when you're carrying something so precious. Daniel, that's not necessary. Isn't it?" He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table between them. "What if something happens in the middle of the night? What if you fall or get sick or need help? I'm 20 minutes away from here, Naomi. 20 minutes that could matter." She could see the fear in his eyes now, barely controlled but definitely there. This was about more than practical concerns. This was about Daniel's deep-seated need to protect what was his, and somewhere along the way, she and their unborn child had become his in a way that transcended their original agreement. "Your penthouse has 1 bedroom, she pointed out reasonably. "I've already called my contractor," Daniel replied without missing a beat. "The guest suite can be converted into a beautiful bedroom for you, private bathroom, sitting area, whatever you need, and the room next to it would make a perfect nursery." Naomi felt her heart skip. He had already planned this out, had already envisioned her living in his space, their child growing up in rooms he was designing in his mind. "You've thought about this," she said softly. "I've thought about nothing else." His admission was quiet, but firm. "Naomi, I know this wasn't part of our original arrangement, but things have changed. I've changed. How have you changed?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in that familiar nervous gesture she'd learned to recognize. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, rougher around the edges. "I can't concentrate at work anymore. I sit in meetings thinking about whether you've eaten lunch, whether you're taking your vitamins, whether you're getting enough rest. Yesterday, I left a board meeting early because you mentioned feeling tired in your text, and I had to see for myself that you were okay." Naomi's breath caught. She remembered that text, a casual mention that she was having a lazy afternoon. She'd thought nothing of it, but apparently it had sent Daniel into a protective spiral. "I've never felt responsible for another person's well-being before," he continued. "Not like this. Not in a way that makes me check my phone every 5 minutes hoping for a message from you. Not in a way that makes me research pregnancy symptoms at 2 a.m. because I want to understand everything you're going through. Daniel, I'm scared, Naomi." The confession escaped him like it had been pulled from somewhere deep inside. "I'm scared that something will happen to you or the baby and I won't be there. I'm scared that I won't be good enough at this, that I'll fail you both somehow. But mostly I'm scared of how much I already care." The last words were barely a whisper, but they hit Naomi like a physical force. This was as close to a declaration of love as Daniel Bolt was capable of making, wrapped in concern for her safety, disguised as practical arrangements, but unmistakably real. "You're not failing us," she said quietly. "If anything, you're amazing at this, at taking care of us." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a softness she'd never seen before. "Us," he repeated, like he was testing how the word felt in his mouth. "Yes, us." Naomi reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You and me and this tiny person we made together." Daniel turned his hand palm up beneath hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. "So you'll consider it moving in?" Naomi looked around her small apartment, the space that had been her sanctuary for 3 years, filled with her books and plants and carefully chosen pieces that reflected who she was. Then she looked back at Daniel, at this man who was offering to rearrange his entire life around her comfort and safety. "What about after?" she asked. "After the baby is born? We never talked about how this would work long term." "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his honesty startling in its completeness. "I can't see that far ahead anymore. All I know is that right now I need you close. I need to know you're safe and cared for, and that I can be there if you need anything." "And you think living together won't complicate things between us?" A smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all morning. "Naomi, I think we passed uncomplicated about 6 weeks ago." Despite everything, she laughed. He was right, of course. Nothing about their situation was simple anymore. They had started as friends, evolved into something resembling partners, and now they were about to become parents. Traditional relationship rules had stopped applying somewhere along the way. "I have conditions," she said finally. Daniel's eyes lit up with hope. "Anything. I keep my independence. This isn't about me becoming some kind of kept woman. I still work. I still make my own decisions. I still have my own life. Of course. And we need to talk about boundaries. Physical boundaries, emotional boundaries. Just because we're living together doesn't mean... Naomi, Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. I would never pressure you for anything you're not ready to give. Our arrangement is exactly what you want it to be, nothing more. She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But all she saw was sincerity and something that looked dangerously close to devotion. Okay, she said softly. I'll move in with you. The smile that spread across Daniel's face was like watching the sun rise. Slow, warm, and absolutely transformative. Without warning, he stood up and came around the table, pulling her gently to her feet and wrapping his arms around her in a hug that felt like coming home. Thank you, he whispered against her hair. You won't regret this, I promise. As Naomi melted into his embrace, breathing in his familiar cologne and feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, she realized that she was already far past the point of regretting anything. She was falling in love with Daniel Bolt, and terrifyingly, wonderfully, it seemed like he might be falling too. She found him in the nursery at 3 a.m., sitting on the floor surrounded by instruction manuals, trying to assemble a crib with tears streaming down his face. Living with Daniel Bolt, Naomi discovered, was like being wrapped in the most luxurious, protective cocoon imaginable. If cocoons came with floor-to-ceiling windows, heated marble floors, and a kitchen that belonged in a 5-star restaurant. It had been 2 weeks since she'd moved into the penthouse, and every morning she still felt a small thrill when she woke up in the beautifully appointed guest suite Daniel had created for her. He'd thought of everything. Blackout curtains for better sleep, a reading nook by the window, fresh flowers that appeared mysteriously every few days, and a mini fridge stocked with her favorite ginger ale for morning sickness. But it wasn't the luxury that had surprised her. It was the way Daniel had seamlessly integrated her into his space and his routines, as if she'd always belonged there. He left for work later now so they could have breakfast together. He came home earlier, usually with some new book about pregnancy or child development tucked under his arm. And every evening, without fail, he would ask about her day with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for matters of national importance. Tonight had been no different. They'd shared dinner, Daniel's attempt at grilled salmon, which had turned out surprisingly well, and watched a documentary about marine life that had made Naomi cry for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. It's the hormones, she'd sniffled, gesturing at the screen where a family of whales was swimming in perfect formation. They're beautiful, Daniel had said softly, but when she looked at him, he wasn't watching the whales. He was watching her. Now, at nearly 3 a.m., Naomi found herself wide awake with that restless energy that pregnancy seemed to bring in waves. She'd tried reading, tried meditation apps, tried counting backwards from 100, but sleep remained elusive. That's when she heard the sounds coming from down the hallway, soft thuds, occasional muttered curses, and what sounded suspiciously like someone struggling with furniture assembly. Naomi slipped out of bed and padded barefoot down the hallway, following the sounds to the room Daniel had designated as the future nursery. The door was slightly ajar, and soft light spilled into the corridor. She pushed the door open quietly and stopped short at the scene before her. Daniel was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, still wearing his pajama pants and a t-shirt that was slightly too small, stretched across his broad shoulders. Around him was what appeared to be the aftermath of a small explosion. Wooden slats, screws, bolts, and at least 3 different instruction manuals spread out like a chaotic map. And he was crying. Not the dramatic, sobbing kind of crying, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who was overwhelmed and trying desperately not to show it. His dark hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his usual composed expression was nowhere to be found. Daniel! Naomi's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. He looked up sharply, his steel blue eyes wide and slightly panicked, like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. He quickly wiped at his face with the back of his hand. I'm sorry, he said quickly, starting to stand. I didn't mean to wake you, I was just trying to... Don't! Naomi held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Don't apologize. What's wrong? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, clearly debating whether to put his walls back up or let her see him like this. Vulnerable and uncertain, and beautifully human. I can't figure out how to put together a crib, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I have 3 advanced degrees. I've built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. I can negotiate deals worth more than most people make in a lifetime, and I can't figure out how to assemble a piece of furniture for our baby. The word "our" hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Naomi moved into the room and sat down on the floor beside him, not caring that she was wearing nothing but an oversized sleep shirt and cotton shorts. She picked up one of the instruction manuals, a bewildering diagram of parts labeled with letters and numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. "These instructions are terrible," she said matter-of-factly. "Look at this. Insert dowel A into slot B using connector C. What even is a dowel?" Despite his emotional state, Daniel let out a small laugh. "I've been asking myself the same question for the past 2 hours. Why are you doing this now?" Naomi asked gently. "It's 3 a.m. and we're still months away from needing a crib." Daniel was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I keep having this dream," he said, staring down at the scattered pieces of wood. "I dream that the baby comes early and I'm not ready. The room isn't finished, the crib isn't built, I haven't read enough books, I don't know enough about being a father. And in the dream, you look at me with such disappointment because I've failed at the most important thing I'll ever do." Naomi felt her heart break a little for this man who carried so much pressure, who held himself to impossible standards in every area of his life. "Daniel," she said softly, reaching over to cover his hand with hers, "you're not going to fail. How can you be so sure?" His eyes met hers, and she saw all his fears laid bare. "I don't know how to be a father, Naomi. I don't know how to love someone that much without it destroying me. What if I mess this up? What if I mess them up?" "You won't. But what if I do? What if I turn out like my father, distant, cold, more concerned with work than with the people who need me?" "You're already nothing like that," Naomi said firmly. "Daniel, you left work early yesterday because I mentioned having a headache. You've read more pregnancy books than I have. You built me a reading nook because you noticed I like to read by natural light. You're sitting on the floor at 3 a.m. trying to build a crib because you want everything to be perfect for our child. How can you possibly think you'll be a distant father?" Daniel looked at her like she had just revealed some fundamental truth he'd been blind to. "Besides," Naomi continued, a small smile playing at her lips, "you're not doing this alone. We're partners in this, remember? And partners help each other figure things out." She picked up one of the wooden slats and examined it thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to say that the most important things in life don't come with instruction manuals. Love, parenting, building a family, you just have to trust your heart and do your best." Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. She also would have told you that any man who cries over trying to build his child's crib is probably going to be an amazing father. Daniel's smile was watery but genuine. "She sounds like she would have liked this arrangement of ours." "Actually," Naomi said, surprising herself with her honesty, "I think she would have told us we were being idiots." "How so?" Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on. "She would have said that two people who care about each other as much as we obviously do shouldn't need an arrangement at all." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither of them was quite ready to cross, but couldn't ignore either. Daniel's thumb brushed across her knuckles where their hands were still joined. "And what would you have told her?" "I would have told her," Naomi said quietly, "that sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying to control how they're supposed to look." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the pieces of their future, literal wooden pieces that would become their child's first bed, and metaphorical pieces of a relationship that was becoming something neither of them had planned, but both were afraid to name. "Come on," Naomi said finally, squeezing his hand. "Let's figure this out together, and if we can't, we'll call someone in the morning who actually knows what a dowel is." Daniel laughed, a real, full laugh that transformed his entire face. "Deal. But I'm warning you, I may have made this more complicated than it needs to be." "Daniel," Naomi said, looking around at the chaos he'd created, "I think that might be your specialty." As they bent their heads together over the instruction manual, their shoulders touching and their voices mixing in quiet consultation, Naomi realized that this moment, sitting on the floor at 3 a.m., trying to build a crib with the man who was slowly stealing her heart, was exactly what happiness felt like. "There's something I need to tell you about our arrangement," Daniel said during their first ultrasound appointment, his voice tight with a secret that was about to shatter everything. The 20-week ultrasound was supposed to be a celebration. The appointment, where they would finally see their baby clearly, where abstract concepts would become tiny fingers and toes on a grainy black and white screen. Naomi had been looking forward to this day for weeks, imagining Daniel's reaction when he saw their child for the first time. Dr. Winters' office was warm and softly lit, with watercolor paintings of flowers on the walls and the kind of gentle classical music that was supposed to be soothing. Naomi lay on the examination table, her growing belly exposed, the cool gel making her shiver slightly despite her excitement. Daniel sat in the chair beside her, impeccably dressed as always in a charcoal grey suit, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests just a little too tightly. "Are you ready to meet your baby?" Dr. Winters asked with a smile, positioning the ultrasound wand against Naomi's skin. The monitor flickered to life, and suddenly there it was, their child. No longer just a collection of cells, but an actual tiny human being, complete with a perfect profile and what looked like Daniel's stubborn chin. "Oh my God," Naomi breathed, tears immediately springing to her eyes. "Daniel, look!" But when she turned to share this moment with him, his face had gone completely white. He was staring at the screen with an expression of pure terror, like he was watching his worst nightmare unfold in real time. "Daniel," Dr. Winters noticed his reaction too. "Are you all right?" He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air, excuse me." And then he was gone, leaving Naomi lying there with gel on her stomach and confusion in her heart, listening to their baby's steady heartbeat filling the silence he'd left behind. "Doctor," Winters finished the examination with gentle professionalism, chatting about the baby's healthy development and giving Naomi printed pictures of the ultrasound. But all Naomi could think about was the look on Daniel's face. Not joy, not wonder, but something that looked devastatingly close to regret. She found him in the hallway outside the office, leaning against the wall with his head in his hands. He looked up when she approached, and she could see that he'd been crying. "Daniel, what's wrong?" She kept her voice gentle, but her heart was racing with fear. "Is it the baby? Are you having second thoughts?" "No," he said quickly, then paused. "Yes, I don't know." He ran his hands through his hair, destroying his usually perfect appearance. "Naomi, there's something I need to tell you about our arrangement, something I should have told you months ago." The word arrangement hit her like a physical blow. In recent weeks, living together, sharing meals, building a crib at 3 a.m., she had begun to forget that this had all started as a business transaction. She had started to believe that what was growing between them was as real as the baby growing inside her. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel looked at her with those steel blue eyes that had become so familiar, so dear, and she saw a pain in them that made her stomach clench. "I lied to you," he said simply. "When I said I wanted a child because I needed an heir, because I wanted a legacy, that wasn't the real reason." Naomi felt the world tilt slightly. "Then why?" "Because I was diagnosed with a genetic condition when I was 25, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something called Huntington's disease. It's degenerative, progressive, and fatal, and there's a 50% chance I'll pass it to any biological children I have." The words hit Naomi like a series of physical blows, each one worse than the last. She leaned back against the wall, needing its support as the full implications of what he was telling her crashed over her. "How long have you known?" she managed to ask. 11 years. My father died from it when I was 30. That's when I got tested. And you didn't think to tell me this before I got pregnant with your child." The question came out sharper than she intended, but she was beyond caring about his feelings right now. He had kept something this monumentally important from her, had let her fall in love with him and carry his child, while hiding the fact that their baby might inherit a death sentence. "I told myself it didn't matter," Daniel said, and she could hear the self-loathing in his voice. "The chances were 50-50. I thought if we didn't talk about it, if I pretended it wasn't a possibility, maybe it wouldn't be." "That's not how genetics works, Daniel." Naomi's voice rose, and several people in the waiting area looked their way. She didn't care. "That's not how anything works." "I know," he whispered. "I know that now. But when I first asked you, I was so desperate for something good in my life, something pure and untainted by all the ugliness I'd been carrying around. You were that for me, Naomi. You and the possibility of a child were the first things that had given me hope in years. So you decided to gamble with our baby's life instead of being honest with me." Daniel flinched at her words, but he didn't deny them. "I was selfish. I was scared. I thought if I told you the truth you'd say no, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing the only chance I might have at this kind of happiness." Naomi closed her eyes, trying to process everything he was telling her. The man she had been falling in love with, the man who had been so careful and protective and seemingly perfect, had built their entire relationship on a lie that affected not just her but the innocent child growing inside her. The symptoms, she said suddenly, opening her eyes. When do they typically start? Usually in the 40s or 50s, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. It's not a pleasant way to die, Naomi. It affects movement, cognition, emotional control. Eventually it affects everything. She thought about the man who had been obsessively reading pregnancy books, who couldn't sleep at night for worrying about their child's future, who had cried over crib instructions because he wanted everything to be perfect. How long did he have before this disease started taking pieces of him away? Is that why you didn't want love? She asked quietly. Because you knew you were going to die? Daniel's composure finally cracked completely. I didn't want anyone to have to watch me deteriorate. I didn't want to be a burden, to leave someone behind to grieve. But then you... God, Naomi, you made me want things I'd convinced myself I could never have. And now? Now I'm terrified, he admitted. I'm terrified that our child will inherit this. I'm terrified that you'll hate me for what I've done. I'm terrified that I've ruined the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too much of a coward to be honest from the beginning. Naomi looked at this man, this flawed, frightened human man who had tried to control an uncontrollable situation and had made it infinitely worse in the process. She thought about the baby growing inside her, about the 50% chance it might carry Daniel's genes and his ultimate fate. She thought about all the conversations they should have had, all the decisions they should have made together, and underneath all the anger and fear and betrayal, she found something else, a love so deep and stubborn that it refused to be extinguished by even this devastating revelation. We need to talk to Dr. Winters, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. We need to know about testing, about options, about what this means for our baby. Daniel stared at her like she had just performed a miracle. You're not leaving. I'm furious with you, Naomi said honestly. I'm more angry than I've ever been in my life. You took away my choice, Daniel. You decided what I could and couldn't handle, and that wasn't your decision to make. He nodded, accepting her anger like a deserved punishment. But I'm not leaving, she continued softly, because that baby in there is half mine, and whatever happens next, we're going to face it together. All of it. The testing, the uncertainty, the possibility that our child might inherit this disease, the possibility that you might get sick someday. We're going to face it honestly this time, with all the information and all the truth. Daniel's face crumpled with relief and gratitude, and love so profound it was almost painful to witness. And Daniel, Naomi reached out and took his hand, intertwining their fingers the way they had that night in the nursery. Next time you have something this important to tell me, you tell me. No matter how scared you are, no matter what you think it might cost us. We're partners in this now, which means we don't make decisions about our future alone anymore. As they walked back into Dr. Winters' office together, still holding hands despite everything that had just been revealed, Naomi realized that this was what real love looked like. Not the fairy tale version where everything was perfect, but the messy, complicated, terrifying version where you chose each other even when the future was uncertain and the odds were against you. The genetic counselor's words echoed in the silence. The test results show that your baby does not carry the Huntington's gene. And Daniel broke down completely. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating afternoon in Dr. Winters' office, and the penthouse had become a place of careful politeness and unspoken tension. Naomi and Daniel moved around each other like dancers who had forgotten their choreography, still in sync, but no longer flowing together naturally. The appointment with Dr. Morrison, the genetic counselor, had been scheduled immediately after Daniel's revelation. They had sat in her sterile office while she explained amniocentesis, risk factors, and timelines in the kind of calm, clinical voice that made life-altering medical decisions sound like routine procedures. The test can determine definitively whether your baby carries the Huntington's gene, Dr. Morrison had explained, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the fluorescent light. There is a small risk to the procedure, but given the circumstances, most couples in your situation choose to proceed. Most couples. The phrase had hung between them, highlighting just how far they were from being a normal couple facing a normal pregnancy. Now, sitting in the same office where they had received the news that would change everything, Naomi felt Daniel's tension like a physical presence beside her. He had barely slept in weeks, had lost weight, and there were lines around his steel blue eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. His hand found hers as Dr. Morrison opened the file containing their results, and Naomi was surprised by how cold his fingers felt, how they trembled slightly against her palm. "Mr. Bolt, Ms. Lewis," Dr. Morrison began. her voice gentler than usual. "I have your test results." Daniel's grip on Naomi's hand tightened almost painfully. "The amniocentesis shows that your baby is developing normally in all respects, and regarding the Huntington's gene—" She paused, looking directly at Daniel. "The test results show that your baby does not carry the gene. Your child will not develop Huntington's disease." The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi felt relief flood through her so powerfully that she momentarily couldn't breathe. Their baby was safe. Their child would not inherit Daniel's terrible genetic legacy. The 50% chance that had haunted her dreams for 3 weeks had resolved in their favor. But when she turned to share this moment of joy with Daniel, what she saw made her heart break all over again. He was sobbing. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had seen from him before, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere so deep inside him that she wondered if they would ever stop. His face was buried in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his relief and gratitude and overwhelming emotion. "Daniel," she whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. He looked up at her with eyes that were red and raw, but somehow brighter than she'd seen them in weeks. "Our baby is safe," he managed to say through his tears. "Naomi, our baby is going to be okay. Our baby, not the baby, or your baby, or even my child. Our baby." As if somewhere in the past 3 weeks of uncertainty and fear, he had claimed not just the child, but the family they were becoming. Dr. Morrison discreetly left them alone in her office, and Naomi found herself crying too, for relief, for the future that had just opened up before them, and for the man beside her who was experiencing emotions too big for his body to contain. "I was so scared," Daniel whispered, when he could finally speak again. "I was terrified that I had cursed our child, that my selfishness had condemned an innocent baby to the same fate I'm facing. But you didn't," Naomi said softly, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to look at her. "Our baby is healthy and safe and free from this disease." Daniel leaned into her touch like a man who had been drowning and finally found solid ground. "I don't deserve this," he said. "I don't deserve this gift, this second chance." "Yes, you do." Naomi's voice was firm, sure. "You made a mistake, Daniel. A big one, a terrible one that hurt me deeply. But you don't deserve to suffer for the rest of your life because of your father's genetics." They sat together in that small office, holding each other while the weight of the past few weeks slowly lifted from their shoulders. But even in her relief, Naomi knew that this news, wonderful as it was, didn't solve everything between them. Later that evening, back in the penthouse, they sat in the living room with the ultrasound pictures spread out on the coffee table between them. The baby looked so perfect in those grainy images, so blissfully unaware of the drama and fear that had surrounded its existence. "I need to know something," Naomi said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence they had been sharing. Daniel looked up from where he had been studying the ultrasound images with the intensity of a man memorizing scripture. "Anything. If the test had come back positive, if our baby did carry the gene, what would you have wanted to do?" It was a question that had been haunting her for weeks, one she hadn't been brave enough to ask until now. Daniel was quiet for so long that she wondered if he was going to answer at all. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been asking myself that same question every day since we got the test done, and the honest answer is that I don't know what I would have chosen." "But you would have let me choose," Naomi said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." His response was immediate, certain. "It would have been your decision to make. Your body, your life that would be most affected. I would have supported whatever you decided, even if it destroyed me." Naomi felt something settle in her chest, a piece of trust that had been damaged but not broken. "Good. That's what I needed to hear. Can I ask you something now?" Daniel's voice was hesitant. "Where do we go from here?" He gestured between them, around the penthouse that had become their shared space. "We started this as an arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. And after everything that's happened, after all the lies and the fear and the uncertainty, where does that leave us?" It was the question Naomi had been avoiding, the conversation she knew they needed to have but had been too afraid to start. She looked at this man, flawed, frightened, but trying so hard to be better than his fears, and realized that she already knew the answer. "It leaves us here," she said simply, "in this beautiful apartment that you've turned into a home for us, with a baby on the way, who's going to need both of us to figure out how to be parents. It leaves us with a choice about what kind of future we want to build together." "And what kind of future do you want?" Daniel asked, his steel blue eyes searching her face. Naomi took a deep breath, feeling like she was about to jump off a cliff with no guarantee of where she would land. "I want the kind of future where we stop pretending this is just an arrangement," she said quietly. "I want the kind of future where we admit that we've fallen in love with each other, even though it wasn't part of the plan. I want the kind of future where we choose each other every day, not because of contracts or genetics or practical considerations, but because we can't imagine our lives without each other." Daniel stared at her like she had just offered him everything he'd ever wanted, but had been too afraid to ask for. "Even knowing that I might get sick someday?" he asked. "Even knowing that there are no guarantees about how much time we'll have?" "Especially knowing that," Naomi replied, "because time isn't guaranteed for any of us, Daniel. But love is. The choice to love each other, to build something beautiful together for however long we have, that's a guarantee we can make to each other." Daniel set down the ultrasound picture he had been holding and moved across the couch to her, taking her hands in his with a reverence that made her breath catch. "I love you, Naomi," he said, the words falling from his lips like a prayer he had been too afraid to speak. "I've been in love with you for months, maybe since that first day when you agreed to this crazy arrangement. I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see good in people even when they can't see it in themselves. I love the way you make me want to be better than I am." "I love you too," Naomi whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I love how you take care of me, how you've changed your entire life around making sure our baby and I are safe and happy. I love how you cry over crib instructions and research pregnancy symptoms at 2 a.m. I love who you are when you stop trying to protect yourself from feeling too much." When Daniel kissed her, it was nothing like the arrangement they had started with. It was a beginning, a promise, a choice to build something real and lasting together. And as they held each other in the soft light of the penthouse that had become their home, with their healthy baby growing strong inside her, Naomi realized that the best love stories weren't the ones where everything was perfect from the start. They were the ones where two imperfect people chose to love each other through the uncertainty, the fear, and the beautiful, terrifying possibility of forever. "I've never been with anyone before," Naomi whispered against Daniel's lips, her confession hanging in the moonlit darkness like a sacred secret that would change everything between them. 2 months had passed since their declarations of love, and the penthouse had transformed from a place of careful politeness into something that felt genuinely like home. Daniel's once sterile living space was now filled with Naomi's touches, fresh flowers in unexpected places, cozy throw blankets draped over his expensive furniture, books scattered on every available surface, and the constant, comforting scent of vanilla candles. At nearly 8 months pregnant, Naomi had developed what Daniel lovingly called her nesting phase, an intense urge to organize, clean, and prepare everything for the baby's arrival. She had rearranged the nursery 3 times, washed tiny clothes that wouldn't be worn for weeks, and created detailed lists for everything from hospital bag contents to middle-of-the-night feeding schedules. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the air between them hummed with a tension that had been building for weeks, ever since the night Daniel had first told her he loved her. Ever since they had begun sharing not just a home, but increasingly intimate moments that left them both breathless and wanting more. They were lying together on the massive sectional sofa in the living room, the city lights twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like earthbound stars. Daniel was reading aloud from a pregnancy book, something about infant sleep patterns, while Naomi rested against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin, but she wasn't listening to the words. She was too aware of the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, the way his deep voice rumbled through his chest when he spoke, the careful way his free hand traced gentle circles on her rounded belly. "Daniel," she interrupted softly. He stopped reading immediately, setting the book aside and shifting so he could look at her face. "What is it? Are you uncomfortable? Do you need more pillows?" Even after all this time, his first instinct was always to take care of her, to anticipate her needs before she could voice them. It was one of the things she loved most about him, this quiet devotion that showed itself in 1,000 small ways every day. "I'm fine," she assured him, then paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say. "I was just thinking about us, about how far we've come." Daniel's steel blue eyes softened, and his hand came up to cup her cheek. "We have come far, haven't we? Sometimes I can barely remember what my life was like before you moved in here, before you made everything warmer." "Warmer," Naomi repeated with a small smile. "I like that." They fell into comfortable silence, but Naomi could feel the weight of unspoken things between them. For weeks now, their goodnight kisses had lingered longer, Their casual touches had carried more heat. Their conversations had been peppered with meaningful looks and careful words that danced around the growing desire neither of them had been brave enough to voice. "There's something I need to tell you," Naomi said finally, her heart racing with the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Daniel's expression grew concerned. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You know how we never really talked about physical intimacy, about what that would mean for us?" Daniel nodded slowly, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "The truth is," Naomi continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've never been with anyone before. Intimately, I mean. You would be my first." The words hung between them like a bridge she had finally found the courage to cross. Daniel went very still, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel both vulnerable and incredibly safe. "Never?" he asked softly. Naomi shook her head. "I told myself I was waiting for the right person, for someone who would see me as whole rather than as an experience to be had. But the truth is, I was waiting for you. I just didn't know it yet." Daniel's expression transformed, cycling through surprise, reverence, and something so tender it took her breath away. "Naomi?" he whispered, her name like a prayer on his lips. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Because once we cross this line—" "I'm sure," she interrupted, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw. "I've been sure for weeks. I love you, Daniel. All of you. I want to share everything with you, not because of our arrangement, not because we're having a baby together, but because I choose you, in every way." Daniel's control, which she had watched him maintain so carefully for months, finally cracked. He leaned down and kissed her with a passion that spoke of weeks of restraint finally released, of love too strong to contain any longer. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "God, Naomi, I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "Don't be terrified," she whispered back, her hands tangling in his dark hair. "Be here with me, be present for this." Daniel pulled back slightly to look at her, his eyes dark with emotion and desire. "Are you comfortable? The baby?" "The baby is fine," Naomi assured him with a soft laugh. "Dr. Winter said intimacy is perfectly safe. And Daniel, I need you to stop thinking like a worried, expectant father for just a little while and think like the man who loves me." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, the last of his careful restraint falling away to reveal the depth of his feelings for her. He stood and gently helped her to her feet, his hands steady and sure as he guided her toward their bedroom, because somewhere along the way it had become their bedroom, even though they had never formally acknowledged the transition. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast everything in silver and shadow, creating an atmosphere that felt almost magical. Daniel moved with careful reverence, treating her like something precious and sacred, his hands gentle as they mapped the curves of her changing body. "You're so beautiful," he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day you grow more beautiful to me." And in that moment, with Daniel's hands on her skin and love shining in his eyes, Naomi felt beautiful. She felt cherished and desired and completely, utterly safe. What happened between them was nothing like the clinical arrangement they had started with. It was tender and passionate and perfect in its imperfection, full of whispered endearments and gentle laughter, and moments of such profound connection that Naomi felt like they were creating something entirely new between them. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness with Daniel's arms wrapped protectively around her and their baby moving gently between them, Naomi realized that this was what she had been waiting for her entire life without knowing it. Not just physical intimacy, but this, the complete trust and vulnerability and love that made every touch, every kiss, every whispered word feel like a gift. "I love you," Daniel murmured into her hair, his voice drowsy with satisfaction and contentment. "I love you too," Naomi replied, pressing a soft kiss to his chest where her head rested. "Was it?" Daniel started to ask, then stopped, seeming suddenly uncertain. "Perfect," Naomi finished for him, tilting her head up to meet his eyes in the moonlight. "It was absolutely perfect." Daniel's smile was soft and wondering, like a man who had just discovered he was capable of miracles. And as Naomi drifted off to sleep in his arms, surrounded by love and safety and the promise of their family, she realized that sometimes the most beautiful things in life weren't the ones you planned for. They were the ones that grew slowly, carefully, from friendship to trust to love, until one day you woke up and realized that everything you had ever wanted was already in your arms. Outside their window, the city continued its restless dance of lights and movement, but inside their bedroom, wrapped in each other's love, Naomi and Daniel had found the kind of peace that comes only from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The arrangement they had started with was long forgotten, replaced by something infinitely more precious, a love story that neither of them had seen coming, but both would treasure for the rest of their lives. "Marry me," Daniel whispered through tears as he held their newborn daughter for the first time, his voice breaking with a love so profound it rewrote everything they thought they knew about forever. The contractions had started at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, gentle at first, like waves lapping at the shore of consciousness. By 6 a.m. they were demanding all of Naomi's attention, and Daniel had transformed into a man possessed, timing intervals, calling Dr. Winters, packing and repacking the hospital bag with the precision of someone orchestrating a military operation. "Daniel, breathe," Naomi had said between contractions, watching her usually composed partner pace their bedroom like a caged animal. "You're more nervous than I am." "I'm not nervous," he'd replied, his voice pitched higher than usual. "I'm prepared. There's a difference." But when another contraction had gripped her with surprising intensity and she'd reached for his hand, Daniel had been there instantly, solid, steady, whispering words of encouragement, while his own hands trembled with barely controlled fear. Now, 12 hours later, everything had changed. Naomi lay in the hospital bed, exhausted but exhilarated, watching the most powerful man she knew reduced to complete emotional devastation by the tiny bundle in his arms. Their daughter, born at 6:47 p.m., weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces of absolute perfection, had entered the world with a cry that seemed to announce her intention to be heard. She was beautiful in that way that all newborns were beautiful to their parents, but looking at her, Naomi saw something that took her breath away. The baby had Daniel's stubborn chin and what looked like it might become his steel blue eyes, but her skin was a perfect blend of both parents, a warm, golden tone that spoke of the love that had created her. "She's perfect," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Naomi, she's absolutely perfect." He had been crying since the moment Dr. Winters had placed their daughter in his arms. Not quiet tears, but the deep, soul-shaking sobs of a man experiencing a love he had never imagined possible. "What should we call her?" Naomi asked softly, watching as their daughter's tiny fist curled around Daniel's finger with the instinctive grip of new life. They had spent months discussing names, creating lists, debating options, but somehow none of their careful preparations seemed adequate for this moment, for this tiny person who had just made them a family. "Sophia," Daniel said without hesitation, looking up at Naomi with eyes that were red from crying but brighter than she'd ever seen them. "It means wisdom. And she's going to be wise, isn't she? Wiser than her father, who spent so many years afraid of loving someone this much." Naomi felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "Sophia Bolt," she said, testing the name. "I love it." "Sophia Lewis Bolt," Daniel corrected quietly. If that's okay with you." The hyphenated name hit Naomi like a physical force. It was more than just a name. It was a declaration, a promise, a statement that this child belonged to both of them equally, that their family was built on love rather than legal documents. "Daniel," she whispered. He carefully transferred Sophia back to Naomi's arms, then sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his large hands framing her face with the same reverence he'd shown on the night they first made love. "I need to say something," he began, his voice steady despite the tears still streaming down his cheeks. "And I need to say it now while she's here listening, so she'll always know." Naomi's heart began racing. "Okay, when I first asked you to have my baby, I thought I knew what I wanted. I thought I could control my heart, could keep this arrangement simple and uncomplicated." Daniel's thumb brushed away a tear from her cheek. "I was so wrong, Naomi, so incredibly beautifully wrong." He looked down at Sophia, who was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm of new life. "You didn't just give me a child," Daniel continued, his voice breaking. "You gave me a family. You gave me a home. You gave me a love so deep and true that it changed everything I thought I knew about what life could be." "Daniel, let me finish," he said softly. "Please, I need to say this." Naomi nodded, her own tears making it difficult to see clearly. "I love you, Naomi Lewis. I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see beauty in ordinary moments. I love how you've made me want to be better than I am, how you've shown me that being vulnerable isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength of all." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Naomi's breath caught in her throat. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting," he said, with a watery laugh, gesturing around the sterile hospital room. "I had planned to do this at home with candles and music and all the romance you deserve. But holding our daughter, seeing the family we've created together, I can't wait another moment." He opened the box to reveal a ring that was breathtaking in its simplicity, a perfect solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the hospital lights and threw rainbows across the white sheets. "Marry me," Daniel whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Not because of an arrangement, not because we have a child together, but because I can't imagine spending a single day of my life without you. Marry me because you're my heart, my home, my forever." Naomi looked at this man, the one who had started as her best friend, become her lover, and was now the father of her child. She thought about the journey they had taken together, from that shocking proposal in a coffee shop to this moment of pure love in a hospital room. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Daniel, yes, I'll marry you." Daniel's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he kissed her, it was with the passion and promise of a man who had finally found everything he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you both so much." As if summoned by her father's declaration, Sophia stirred in Naomi's arms, opening eyes that were indeed Daniel's steel blue, but somehow softer, filled with the infinite possibility of a life just beginning. "Hello, sweetheart," Naomi whispered to her daughter. "Welcome to our family." Daniel reached out to stroke Sophia's tiny cheek with one finger, his touch impossibly gentle. "She's going to grow up knowing she was wanted," he said quietly. "She's going to grow up in a house full of love, with parents who chose each other every single day. And she's going to know," Naomi added, looking up at the man who had become her everything, "that sometimes the most beautiful love stories start with the most impossible proposals." Daniel laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the hospital room with warmth. "Are you saying you're glad I asked you to have my baby in the middle of a coffee shop?" "I'm saying," Naomi replied, her engagement ring catching the light as she adjusted their daughter's blanket, "that I would say yes to that proposal 1,000 times over if it meant ending up here with you and Sophia." As evening settled over the city beyond their hospital window, the three of them sat together in the golden glow of new love and new life. Daniel's arms wrapped around both his girls, his family, his heart made manifest in flesh and blood and the promise of forever. And in that moment, surrounded by love and possibility and the sweet weight of their sleeping daughter, Naomi realized that this was what happily ever after actually looked like. Not perfect but real, not planned but chosen, not an ending but a beginning. The arrangement that had brought them together was forgotten, replaced by something infinitely more precious, a love story that would be told in whispered lullabies, in family dinners, in quiet moments stolen between the beautiful chaos of raising a child together. It was a love story that would last a lifetime, built not on contracts or agreements, but on the simple, revolutionary choice to love each other completely every single day, for all the days to come. 3 years later, the morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of their suburban home, a charming colonial that Daniel had insisted on buying when Sophia started walking, claiming the penthouse was no place for a toddler to explore safely. The house was everything the penthouse wasn't, lived in, warm, filled with the comfortable chaos that came with loving and being loved. Naomi stood at the island, packing Sophia's lunch for her first day of preschool, when she felt familiar arms wrap around her from behind. Even after 3 years of marriage, 4 years of knowing she was completely loved, Daniel's touch still sent warmth spreading through her chest. "She's going to be fine," he murmured against her hair, reading her maternal anxiety with the ease that came from truly knowing someone. "I know," Naomi replied, leaning back against his chest. "It's just, she's so little. What if the other kids aren't nice to her? What if she gets scared and I'm not there?" Daniel turned her gently in his arms, his steel blue eyes, now crinkled at the corners with laugh lines that hadn't existed when they first met, soft with understanding. "She's not just little, Naomi. She's fierce, she's curious, she's kind. She's everything good about both of us rolled into one incredible little person." He smiled, brushing a strand of her natural hair behind her ear. "And if anyone isn't nice to Sophia Lewis-Bolt, they're going to have to answer to her mother, the strongest woman I know." The sound of small feet thundering down the stairs interrupted them, and Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway like a tiny whirlwind. At 3, she was all energy and curiosity, with Daniel's stubborn determination and Naomi's warm heart. Her hair was a mass of loose curls that caught the morning light, and she wore her new preschool outfit like armor, a bright yellow dress with sunflowers that she had insisted on picking out herself. "Is it time? Is it time for big girl school?" Sophia asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Almost, sweetheart," Naomi said, kneeling down to Sophia's level. "Are you ready for your big adventure?" Sophia nodded solemnly, then threw her arms around Naomi's neck with the fierce affection that characterized everything she did. "I'm ready, Mama, but I'm gonna miss you. I'm going to miss you too, baby. But you know what? What? Daddy and I will be here when you get home and you can tell us all about your day, every single detail." Daniel crouched down beside them, joining their little huddle. "And tonight, we'll make pancakes for dinner to celebrate your first day, the special ones with the chocolate chips." Sophia's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Promise?" "Promise," Daniel said solemnly, holding out his pinky finger for their traditional promise shake. As they drove to the preschool in Daniel's sensible SUV, a far cry from the luxury sports car he'd driven when they first met, Naomi watched her husband in the rearview mirror, making silly faces at Sophia to keep her entertained during the drive. This was the man who had once claimed he didn't know how to love, who had approached fatherhood like a business proposal, who had been terrified of vulnerability. Now he spent Saturday mornings having tea parties with stuffed animals, read bedtime stories with voices for every character, and could calm Sophia's nightmares with nothing more than his presence and a whispered lullaby. The preschool was a cheerful building, painted in bright primary colors, with a playground that looked like something from a fairy tale. Other parents were dropping off their children, and Naomi felt a familiar flutter of nerves. "She's going to love it here," Daniel said quietly, reading her thoughts again. And she was right. Sophia marched into her new classroom with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that the world was full of people who would love her, who had grown up secure in the knowledge that she was wanted, cherished, and completely safe. After they kissed her goodbye and promised to be back at pickup time, Naomi and Daniel walked back to their car in comfortable silence. "Remember when we thought this was just going to be about having a baby?" Naomi said as they drove home. Daniel reached over and took her hand, his wedding ring catching the sunlight. "Best worst plan I ever had," he said with a smile. "Worst plan? Thinking I could keep my heart out of it. Thinking I could have you in my life and not fall completely, irrevocably in love with you." They had reached a red light, and Daniel lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her wedding ring, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "Do you ever regret it?" Naomi asked. "The way we started? How complicated everything was." Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he always did when she asked something important. "No," he said finally. "I regret the lies, the fear, the way I almost let my own damage ruin the best thing that ever happened to me. But I don't regret asking you. I don't regret that crazy, desperate proposal in the coffee shop, because it gave me you, it gave me Sophia, it gave me a life I never thought I deserved." The light turned green, but Daniel didn't immediately press the gas. Instead, he turned to look at her fully. "I love you, Naomi Bolt," he said, using her married name with the same reverence he'd shown on their wedding day. "I love the woman you were when you said yes to an impossible arrangement. I love the woman you became as we figured out how to be a family. And I love the woman you are now, the mother of my child, the love of my life, my best friend, and my forever." "I love you too," Naomi replied, her heart as full as it had been on that morning 3 years ago when he'd proposed in a hospital room with their newborn daughter in her arms. The car behind them honked gently, and they both laughed, Daniel finally accelerating through the intersection. That evening, as promised, they made chocolate chip pancakes for dinner, and Sophia regaled them with stories from her first day of school, new friends, finger painting, a story about a brave princess who saved a dragon instead of the other way around. Later, after Sophia was tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed elephant and at least 3 bedtime stories, Naomi and Daniel sat together on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "She's going to be okay, you know," Daniel said, understanding that Naomi was still processing the milestone of their daughter's first day of school. "I know, it's just, she's growing up so fast. Soon she'll be in real school, then high school, then college." Naomi trailed off, the future suddenly feeling both infinite and fleeting. "And through all of it, she'll know she's loved," Daniel said. "She'll know that love isn't something you have to earn or prove you deserve. She'll know that love is something you choose every day and something that chooses you back." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, hearts full, watching the day fade into night over the home they had built together. Not just the house with its white picket fence and swing set in the backyard, but the life they had created from the most unlikely beginning. "Daniel," Naomi said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to ask me an impossible question. For being brave enough to love me even when you were terrified of it. For giving me Sophia and this life and a love story that's better than anything I could have imagined." Daniel brought their joined hands to his chest, over his heart that beat steadily and surely for her, for them, for the family they had built together. "Thank you," he replied, "for saying yes." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their home, Naomi realized that this was what forever actually looked like. Not a destination you arrived at, but a choice you made every single day. A choice to love completely, to build something beautiful together, to say yes to the impossible and watch it become everything you never knew you needed. Sometimes, the most extraordinary love stories began with the most ordinary words. "I need to ask you something." And sometimes, if you were very lucky, your answer to that impossible question would give you a lifetime of moments like this, sitting on your back porch with the love of your life, watching the sunset over the family you built together, one brave choice at a time. Looking back at their journey, from that shocking proposal in a coffee shop to building a family filled with love, one question remains. Would you have been brave enough to say yes to love, even when it came in the most unexpected package? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.